its allies' future. What happens if the government falls? It's a question AlJazeera put to the U.S. State Department.
Yes, Yemen is a very important country to the United States.
So what impact does this unrest have on that security concern?
Well, they're not mutually exclusive. In other words, there is a genuine security concern in Yemen that is a concern for Yemen and for the United States.
But members of the Yemeni American community argue the al-Qaeda threat in Yemen is overstated. If the government collapses, they say al-Qaeda would have little support.
Al-Qaeda has no base with the Yemeni people. Al-Qaeda is hated in Yemen.
Despite the challenges of the Yemen protests, Washington's hopeful any imminent threats can still be contained. Kimberly Halkett, AlJazeera, Washington.
The Afghan President Hamid Karzai has told the United States that saying sorry for civilian deaths in his country isn't enough. There were hundreds of protesters on the streets of Kabul demonstrating against U.S. military operations. Last week, Mr. Karzai warned Obama that civilian casualties were a serious problem. The number of civilian deaths has jumped in the past year as insurgents increasingly attack soft civilian targets. Let's talk to Phyllis Bennis, director of the New Internationalism Project, joins us now from Washington, D.C. Is it not fair to say that this comment by Hamid Karzai is purely for internal consumption, because he still needs the U.S. forces there and he knows it?
He does, but he also is facing a very clear reality that his government is very unpopular. The levels of corruption, the levels of inability to bring security to the country have brought even higher levels of antagonism to his government. So he's really stuck. It is for internal consumption, but it's also a point of concern for people in my country, here in the U.S., David. Our tax money, our policy is responsible for killing children in Afghanistan in a war that we cannot afford, we cannot win, and that is ultimately illegitimate. There is a huge level of public opposition to the war here in the United States. 72% at the last poll say the U.S. must move much more quickly than President Obama has said he will so far to pull troops out. So when attacks like this happen, where 9 children are killed, another attack a few days ago where it was an IED, presumably planted by the opposition, the Taliban or someone else, aimed at U.S. soldiers, what we know is that the presence of more armed soldiers, in this case U.S. soldiers, is simply escalating the level of violence in the country as a whole, across Afghanistan.
But what
it's
about
not keeping them safe.
The American citizens? They worried that an absence of American troops in Afghanistan could return that country to pre-2001 days, when attacks against the United States were organized from there.
You know, I think that if you ask people, some will be concerned about that. I think many people are aware that the attacks were not organized in Afghanistan. They were organized in Hamburg. They weren't carried out by Afghans. They were carried out by Saudis. They didn't go to flight school in Afghanistan. They went to flight school in Minnesota. So this is not a situation where Afghanistan is the root of the attacks of 9/11.
But I mean,
what has
this
happened
is something
from
that I
9/12
would bring up with you here, because while it may not have been the staging point for so many of the elements of the attack, it possibly was the crucible for it.
Absolutely. They were inspired by someone who was living in Afghanistan. That's certainly true. But it's also true that when the Taliban was overthrown was only after people associated with them had carried out an act like this. The Taliban are certainly not likely to repeat that. They had actually tried to turn over bin Laden and others for trial if there were evidence shown to them and if they could turn them over to another country. The U.S. turned down that request at the time back in 2001. The point is, this war is seen in the United States as not being in U.S. national interest at a moment when we cannot afford for example, David, look, the cost just of the escalation last year, just the escalation alone, not the whole war, was $33 billion. That could have paid for 600,000 new green middle-class jobs here in the United States and still had $3 billion left over to help Afghans rebuild their country so that it wasn't any longer a, quote, failed state. By militarizing the conflict, we're putting more Afghans at risk, we're bringing more hatred and antagonism towards the United States, and we're not keeping anyone safer, and we're wasting money. It's not a good fit for anybody.
That's Phyllis Bellis. Thank you very much indeed. Good to have you on the programme. China's government has now tightened controls on foreign media and steps up security in Beijing and Shanghai after calls for pro-democracy protests there. Security forces kept a very close eye on Beijing's Tiananmen Square and possible protest sites in a bustling shopping district. The calls for the demonstrations have been inspired by the uprisings in the Middle East. Meanwhile, protesters in Hong Kong have taken to the streets again to support the so-called Jasmine movement. Here's Rob McBride.
A tiny protest with big hopes. A handful of activists, outnumbered at least 10 to 1 by police, turning up in support of China's Jasmine movement. It was an even smaller turnout than the week before. Then the confrontation with police angrier, with protesters vowing to continue indefinitely despite their number.
But we will come here every Sunday in support of the Jasmine movement in China. Actually, we are all prepared to be arrested.
In mainland China, with the opening of the National People's Congress and the leadership vowing to maintain stability at all costs, activists there face an almost impossible task to organize any meaningful protests. A heavy security clampdown in the streets and in cyberspace will see to that. Allowed to protest here in Hong Kong, activists in this well-connected city are also free to use as many online tools as their fingers will allow in their continuing campaign. Fanning Yim is in touch with 10 activists in mainland China, tweeting their news onto 1,000 other people.
It's basically two types of news: activists who have been detained, and then also dates, times, and venues of Jasmine Revolution gatherings.
An online community quietly hacking away at the system.
There are lots of restrictions in China, but there are also lots of hackers in China. And therefore, they are smart and they know how to gain the information beyond the state control.
Activists here say their campaign is different to the Middle East, insisting their long, slow approach will eventually take hold. But as this protest ended for another week, the numbers are so small it's sometimes hard to see any movement at all. Rob McBride, AlJazeera, Hong Kong.
Fancy a night out on the Indonesian island of Java and a chance to earn some money too? How do you do it? Here's Stepfassen.
A watchful eye, hunters ready for action. Armed with sticks and hooks, they spot their prey. A sudden attack. The animal doesn't stand a chance. Their prey is not a bear or a pig, but a small lizard. Still, it's dangerous work.
I have been bitten before, and because I tried to pull the gecko from my arm, it started to bite harder, and I got a nasty flesh wound. I cured my wound with tree wax.
Hunters can spot the small animals in the dark because their headlights make their eyes turn red. As soon as night falls, geckos come down from the trees looking for food. That's when the hunters venture out.